Descriptive research. So, like I said, there are two main tasks to the scientific approach in general, two main things a scientist might be interested in doing: describing the world, or taking an existing description and using it to explain something about the world, to gain explanatory value out of their theories. We'll start with descriptive research here, but like I said just in the previous video, correlational research is a type of descriptive research, but there's a bunch of types of descriptive research that are not correlational, so we'll cover them separately because they kind of have their own unique properties and applied traditions to them. So, to count as a description in a scientific context, in the same way that there are certain criteria that we have for predictions, a prediction must be about something observable, it must be falsifiable, etc. For a description to count as scientific, to say that the measurements I'm taking of reality have scientific meaning to them, there's generally three criteria. I mean, only two really, but the last one is an ethical criteria that we add on top of it. First, our measurements of reality, our descriptions, must be sufficiently detailed to say something meaningful about the phenomena in general. Very hazy or unreliable or shoddy measurements of reality, we just will not have enough certainty in them. There will not be enough information in them for them to be scientifically useful. So we say that the level of detail is important. It's especially important as sciences grow over time, because what used to be a sufficient level of detail in psychology, in medical science research, in in physics, things like this, the standard of detail lifts over time. If you want to incrementally improve science, if you want to expand your theories more over what was known in the past, generally the level of detail is always rising. We're always improving our standards in that regard. But one of the other most important things about this, the other defining characteristic of a scientific description, is it has to be systematic. And when I say systematic, it means that there has to be a clear, non-biased criteria as to how you are drawing your observations, how you're drawing together the different elements of your description. If you're just following what looks good to you, if you're just going where you think you'll find what you're looking for, again, if you're just listening to your confirmation bias, the natural cognition part of our folk psychology, you will get a very skewed picture of reality. You won't get a picture of reality that covers all of its different aspects to a representative degree. And that's what we mean by systematic. To be systematic is to have a plan set out ahead of time to make sure that you are not biased, to make sure that you're drawing observations evenly from all the potential different sources that might be relevant to the topic that you're discussing. You're not avoiding certain elements of the population. You're not automatically screening out people who aren't interested in taking your survey. You're not accidentally excluding people who don't speak the language the survey was written in, things like this. That's what we talk about when we say systematicity, to make sure that you've put some methods in place to avoid the various biases of sampling and measurement that might otherwise come out along the way. And this last point that I mentioned here, it's more an ethical point than an epistemological point in science, but we generally try to obtain our observations with the minimum disruption or damage to the subject matter. One of the most tragic things that we say about, old world science and things like this is that sometimes we murder to dissect. Sometimes you destroy what you're trying to look at in order to get information about it. And while that is, in some senses, necessary, we need to conduct dissections, autopsies, things like this to figure out some important details of reality. Whenever possible, we try to leave the phenomena we're studying as intact and unmolested as possible, just not only so that it will still be there for us to come back and do more research on in the future, but just to not give science a bad name as best as we can. It's an ethical obligation we have in that sense. So in that spirit, when we talk about the different types of broad descriptive research categories, we usually do them as a little hierarchy. We split them apart based on how invasive measurement is in this context. If we rank them like this, naturalistic observation is the least invasive way of taking descriptive research. Case studies are the second least invasive, and surveys are more invasive than the other two, but come with their own cost-benefit analysis. So just to explain what these terms mean, naturalistic observation is any time you're taking measurements of the world non-intrusively, just viewing the apparent details of some phenomena in usually a naturalistic or non-contrived setting. So, when you were in high school and the head of a department would just stand in the back of the room and watch teaching taking place, that was a kind of naturalistic observation. When Jane Goodall just lived amongst a bunch of chimps and tried her best not to get in the way of their everyday lives, just watch their obvious behaviors and record what they were doing, that's naturalistic observation. Whereas if you have to have any mode of intervention on this, especially if it is long-term intervention with a small number or even just one target of your population, of your study in that sense, that's what we mean when we talk about a case study. A case study is a long-term follow-up and documentation of a particular example, a particular family, a particular person, a particular clinical cohort, something like this. And the nature of a case study is that usually this is measurement being done as part of some intervention. The most common ones in psychology are the long-term notes taken by therapists and other doctors who are trying to treat somebody who has a problem long-term. In the same sense, there are sometimes long-term case studies where people show up with an unexpected illness, and you just need to track long-term everyone who had that illness and what happens to them while you're trying to fix the problem. So that's a bit more invasive than the naturalistic observation because there's some intervention involved, but it's still pretty on the loose there. Whereas surveys are, and again, most of you will be familiar with survey is the most common research method in the modern world here. Surveys are the administration of a limiting set of questions or criteria. You set up your measurement criteria in advance and ask your participants or your sample to meet those criteria in order to give you your responses that allow you to foster comparisons between multiple observations or between multiple participants. Again, if you are in a case study, if you have a problem or you have ideas on an issue, you just say whatever you want, and everything that you say will be recorded in its original context. But the nature of a survey is we'll ask you some questions. You don't get to just talk willy-nilly. We'll ask you some questions, you'll answer some tests, you'll fill out some criteria, and because we have constrained the way you are responding, those modes of response are comparable because everyone answers the same way. We can compare multiple people and multiple groups' responses to each other. So in that sense, it is the most limiting and most invasive of the different forms of measurement in descriptive research, but it fosters comparisons and statistical parallels that we otherwise wouldn't be able to do. Now, in that sense, if you're looking at this in the textbook and things like that, you will sometimes hear two different terms used, especially for case studies and surveys, that case studies and to a lesser extent naturalistic observation are idiomatic modes of description. That is to say that they are shaped entirely by the particulars of the subject and the investigator in a particular case. That's what idiomatic means, if you ever see that word, where surveys are what we refer to as nomothetic. A nomothetic approach to description results in something where you've structured the shape of how the responses are going to take place. You've limited the response criteria, often very severely, giving people just multiple choice answers or checklists and things like this. But your ability to do additional comparisons, and therefore your ability to process data on the level of a sample group, and say things about a population instead of just individuals, that's the main benefit that you get out of a nomothetic approach. Idiomatic approaches go into a lot of detail on specific people and therefore can be very useful early on. But if you want to say things about how to apply new insights to a population, how to generalize from samples, things like this, you need to take a nomothetic approach. The only real limitation to a nomothetic approach is that while in an idiomatic approach, whatever details are relevant will just emerge as a natural part of the process. In a nomothetic approach, you have to pre-specify all the criteria you're going to be using. So if you just miss something or don't realize until too late that something is important, it won't be part of the analysis. You need to think ahead very carefully with the decisions you make in things like surveys in nomothetic approaches. Now, when we are structuring these observations, again, depending on how intrusive they were, there are a bunch of different ways of doing it. Some observations don't need to be organized at all. It's just, saying whether something did or did not happen, counting how many chimpanzees were in a clearing one day, things like this. Also, very often we will sometimes create, time sequences for things we're looking at. How many chimpanzees showed up on Tuesday rather than on Thursday? How many times did the cricket jump in 1 minute when it was or wasn't administered cocaine? Things like this. That's a real experiment that we always do in psychology. But the most useful way in the modern world to structure your observations in descriptive research is to take one variable, one thing that you have measured that can have different levels to it, and another variable, maybe time, maybe, different locations, maybe just another set of measurements you've taken from your population, and see how well they predict each other. You use a statistical tool, the correlation coefficient, to see how well you could predict the levels of one variable with another variable. That's the most useful way we have to pick out descriptive patterns in the environment. That's why correlations are a form of descriptive research. Correlational research is descriptive by its nature, but because of the nature of how useful the correlation coefficient is, we give it its own category, which we're going to get to next.